Testing? Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Okay. Cool. Great turnout. So before I get started, the materials for this talk are on a GitHub repo that you can access through this URL. It contains these slides as well as kind of the workshop/demo component of this talk. This session is kind of like one part talk, 2 parts workshop, fun time. So I'm not talking at you for a straight hour. You're welcome to follow along or just watch. So for anyone who just popped into the room, in this session we're going to be talking a bit about how to accelerate your workflow from local Python prototype from your local dev environment up to the cloud. So thanks for joining. But before kind of jumping into the bulk of this talk, I figured I should probably introduce myself for folks who I have not met, either in person or on the internet, because we live in a post-pandemic world. But I'm Savannah Ostrowski. I'm a senior product manager at Microsoft. I currently work on Azure Cloud Native Developer Tools and Experience. And I'm also the product lead for the Azure Developer CLI, or AZD. Before that, I worked on the Pylance language server, which if you use Visual Studio Code, powers the editing experience there. I also worked on a variety of other Python developer experience things like Python in Visual Studio, WSL, on Azure, and general Python ecosystem research. And before that, I was a software engineer at a bunch of startups, consultancies, doing Python and non-Python things. I've been writing Python for, this is basically a decade this year, and this is my very first in-person PyCon. So very excited to be here. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna take this, start at a very kind of high level, I guess. But I want you to think back to a time where you were building an application and think about it at a very high level in terms of components. And so if you can't think of anything, we can all think about maybe a to-do application that has a front end, a back end, and a database. And this to-do application, you maybe have features like adding tasks, setting due dates, ticking things off, sorting things into lists. And I think for most folks, this step is pretty easy to understand and kind of imagine or ideate on. And in fact, for a lot of engineers, I think you kind of skip over this step and go straight into implementation, especially if you're building something that's a hobbyist project. But yeah, at a high level, you'd need a UI, an API, and a database. So taking this a step further, I think similarly, it's kind of easy to imagine a world where you take those components and map them to some tech stack. And so this is kind of the first set of big decisions you need to make about your application. Maybe you have a tech stack that you like to use. Maybe you need to do some research to kind of figure out the best options. But after careful consideration, you might decide on something like React for your front end, Python with Fast API for your back end, and MongoDB, Postgres, something for your database. And so from here, maybe you start building an application, or maybe you started designing and building in tandem. I'm not here to mandate any particular development process, you do you. And I think, again, this is pretty approachable. I think there are a number of tutorials or blog posts that even if you're new, figuring out how to start, or at least at a high level, is pretty easy, pretty approachable. Okay, how do we get this up into the cloud? You have something working great locally. Maybe you have your front end, it looks great, all your API is wired up, you have a database, and then you're okay, I'm ready to share this out with the world, to meet some business use case, or maybe I'm sharing a hobbyist project with my friends. And then you're kind of sitting there and you're oh, it's actually, I don't really know where to start. And so I want to talk about a kind of common, albeit suboptimal workflow, which I kind of cutely call the local application to I'll just put it on a VM pipeline, which we've all been there before, no shame in that game. But I think unless you have you're well-versed in cloud offerings, this is, a pretty common workflow. And so it might start out, if you're new, with complete uncertainty, giant question mark in your head, right? And then you decide to do some research about maybe what cloud offerings you would want to use, what services. And you ultimately have very high-level questions like, which cloud services should I use with my code? Which cloud service should I use over another cloud service? What are the pros and cons? How much does stuff cost? Do I set up my local development environment so that I can be productive while developing against cloud resources? How do I provision the right infrastructure? How do I know that what I'm doing is secure and using best practices? And I think the frustrating part about all of that, right, is that every single one of those questions I just listed off has an "it depends on X, Y, or Z" being the answer to any one of those things, which makes things complicated, time-consuming, and pretty irritating. And so you end up being that like blobby guy in the middle there, right? Where you're like, my head hurts, I just banged my head against a wall for several days. And then you're just like, VM. Let's just throw it on VM and hope that that's good enough. And again, that's fine. I'm not here to shame anyone for just putting stuff on a virtual machine, but I think if we're trying to, like the first or maybe even the nth time we're trying to like learn how to do things the right way, and I'll come back to what the right way means in a second, it ends up being like very time-consuming and difficult. And often when I talk about this problem, this local app I'll just put it on a VM pipeline, I sort of boldly frame it as developers don't care about the cloud. And usually this turns some heads because I work on Azure. And what I really mean by this is that application developers don't always have the luxury of caring about the cloud. I think if you're a new developer, you're writing Python for, maybe your first Python app, you're already sort of like inundated with the idea of trying to get your local app code to work. And so taking on researching cloud offerings and all the configurations and doing things the right way is like completely out of scope for you at that point. And if you're like working as a professional engineer or in like business logic to solve some particular problem, you might not have the time to learn about the cloud and all the ins and outs of the cloud. You might just want to focus on writing the application code, because at the end of the day, like getting stuff in the cloud is really just a hurdle on the way from like A to B, right? You want to write that application code to like serve some audience to address some problem, but you have this like thing that gets in the way of you doing that. And so the cloud things are really like peripheral to the primary task at hand. And for some folks who are lucky, they have a dedicated DevOps or like NGSys person who kind of thinks through all these hard problems, and it's their job to like make the right choices. But sometimes that's not the case, right? Like if you're working on a hobbyist project or you're working at a startup or a small business, you might not have a dedicated person for this, which means that it's your problem. And that problem of local development environment to the cloud or provisioning infrastructure and deploying code ultimately hinders your productivity and velocity on that path from A to B, right? And so to further magnify this, I'm like digging myself into a hole as I'm talking, but to further magnify this, I think what makes this really complicated is that cloud resources don't map one-to-one with your local app stack, right? So in this case, let's come back to that to-do application with our front-end, back-end database. Really simple, right? I think that, and I use this to-do application as a canonical example, but I think this like really does map and kind of scale to whatever it is that you're imagining. But to get that basic 3-component application up and running on Azure, it actually looks something more like 9 things in practice. And of course, there are like many different ways that you can get your application up and running on Azure. I'm going to talk through one example that uses Azure Container Apps. But again, 3 things really is like 9 things. And so let's go through this kind of architecture diagram. For this particular app, we would need like a container app environment, which defines a secure boundary around your containers so that we can share the same virtual network and write logs to the same logging destination. A container registry to build, manage, and store container images. 2 container app instances for the front end and back end of the application. A key vault, because we don't want to be inlining our tokens and our passwords, because that's not secure. Cosmos DB API for MongoDB for our database. If you're using Postgres, Postgres would be the database here. And then log analytics workspace so that we can actually have logging infrastructure, application insights to actually have live app performance management and monitoring, and a portal dashboard. But like not only that, we'd also need to figure out how to set up roles and permissions, set up our local development environment with all the right extensions so that we could be productive when locally developing, figure out how to write queries and build charts so that we can have proper monitoring for our application. Probably want CI/CD so that when we're pushing new code, we're not breaking our app with every new commit. And so, yeah, that's, again, a lot to think about and manage, right? Especially if you're not well-versed in cloud infrastructure or architecture. And so that's kind of those like that simplicity versus like doing the right thing are kind of at odds, right? And so there's the I'll do the easiest thing and just like put it on a VM, and I'm using that as an example, but there are other easier solutions as well. And then there's like, I'll use the right cloud resources for my application. And so what does that mean, right? Using the right cloud resources is probably what I would consider it means to be cloud native. And I actually hate buzzwords, so I like low-key resent myself for putting this slide in here. But I think it's important because, and everyone has a different definition of cloud native, but what does it mean, right? Like, building something in a cloud native way means that we're building, deploying, and managing our application for the cloud, and in a way that makes use of what the cloud has to offer. And then, you might think about things like load balancing, scaling, containers, microservice architecture, and all that, and that's great. But what do those things get you? Like, at the end of the day, like, why do people even care about cloud native? Really, what those things get you are a resilient, manageable, and observable application, which what I would argue is really just you setting future you up for success. Leveraging cloud technology also means that you're able to make big changes to your application infrastructure later on with minimal effort. So again, it's future thinking, future-proofing your app, right? So at this point, you're probably like, either you already knew the cloud was hard and you wanted to do the right thing but didn't know how, or now you're like, wow, Savannah, you've told me that it's super hard, and that's great, and you want me to be set up for future success, but it's not really like I can just like lean my head against a computer and like learn by osmosis all the things about the cloud overnight. And so this is sort of where I want to introduce you to something that my team has been working on that sort of aims to solve this problem and kind of support you in the end-to-end workflow from local app environment to the cloud. So yeah, let's talk about the Azure Developer CLI. So AZD, or it's also known as AZD, which is the command line utility, is an open source tool that provides higher level application developer friendly commands that map to key stages in your developer workflow so that you can focus on writing app code without focusing on those atomic operations on Azure. So I think if you've used CLI experiences before, I think a really common thing is you have to invoke commands on specific resources with a million parameters and flags, and hopefully you remember them, but you probably don't, so you have to look it up pretty much every time you have to do something. And that's not very developer friendly. But AZD, the whole point is to keep things like very high level, very simple, and follow more of like a Git-centric workflow. So in this case, you have AZD init, which initializes an application for the cloud, AZD up, which packages provisions and deploys your app code to the cloud, monitor to check out your dashboards that are monitoring your app health, and then also AZD pipeline config to set up CI/CD. So you might be wondering, where did all the complexity go? Because it still exists, right? How do we get away with being so high level? But the AZD approach is rather declarative in nature rather than being imperative. So we use kind of these extensible, customizable application templates that kind of are the foundation for the Azure Developer CLI. They include everything that you need to get up and running on Azure. And so I like to think about these templates as sort of like cloud blueprints and like foundational recipes. So the idea is that you would find a template that maps to your local application stack. So maybe it is that React Python with Fast API, Postgre, or MongoDB. Find that, swap out the application code that's included as a proof of concept in that template, and then leverage the infrastructure as code assets to get everything up and running on Azure. So kind of that complexity of the cloud is not obfuscated from you, but at least it's there, but kind of deferred in a way, so that you don't have to dig into all of it on day zero. You can kind of incrementally touch the infrastructure as code, change the configurations for resources as you have problems that you're trying to work through, or you need beefier machines, or you need, kind of more approachable, as opposed to just dumping you in the deep end and saying best of luck in the cloud. And so the infrastructure as code, we support both Bicep, which is a domain-specific language that's used for provisioning Azure resources, as well as Terraform. And again, these templates aren't just hello world. They go end to end. So they include things like they support you through project initialization, local development with configurations for things like VS Code, Visual Studio, code spaces, dev containers, all that good stuff. As well as pipeline definitions for GitHub Actions and Azure pipelines, if that's your flavor of CI/CD provider. And so it's not just like, oh, we got the app running, it's deployed, it's hosted. It's doing all the best practice things in a secure way with a combination of cloud resources that we can all believe and endorse. So we have templates that our team has authored to kind of get people started, but we've actually had a lot of open source contributions from the community as well through all kinds of programming languages, including Python. They are all, I'm going to show this in a second, but we have a template gallery website called AwesomeAZD, which hosts kind of a curated view of that. But yeah, so, and these templates, they are also like programming language idiomatic, so they're written in a way that is hopefully understandable to Python developers, as opposed to like taking constructs that are very cloud specific. We try and make them as approachable as possible. So yeah, and I just like breezed over infrastructure as code, which maybe everyone knows about, but I also want to just take a second to like talk about infrastructure as code, because I think before I worked on this product, I actually wasn't very well versed in IAC. And so I want to just take a second to like talk through that and what value that adds. And so, as I mentioned, like each template does include reusable infrastructure as code that you can modify, you can change. There's no magic here. Everything is there in a very declarative way. This means that it's also reusable and repeatable. So instead of like you or your team having to remember a million different flags or parameters and hopefully getting it right and managing individual environment settings, it's all right there in the code. You can well document it. You can commit it to source control. Everyone's working off the same stuff. This also means that when you deploy your code, you're defining an environment in a way that is going to be generated in the same way each time, which helps you avoid deployment issues and keeps everything very consistent. And I want to highlight that like these are included, but they're not necessarily part of like your day one or day zero journey on Azure or with the Azure Developer CLI, but they are very foundational to how the Azure Developer CLI knows what you want to provision, how it's wired up, and all of that. And so, you know, again, kind of you can iterate on that as you need, or not. It's kind of up to you. Okay. So I just talked at you for, I don't know how long, like 15 minutes maybe. This is kind of where I guess it gets more interactive. There are Azure codes for credits on chairs. If you don't have one, there are extra codes at the front. You can follow along or just like hang out and watch, but I'm going to walk through the Azure Developer CLI workflow. And this can be interactive. I don't have to like talk at you. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. We also have Dawn and Luciana who will be walking around to kind of help people with setup and stuff. So yeah, ask questions as they arise. So I'm going to start off by going to, let me see if I can. So I'm on this AwesomeAZD website that I mentioned before. This is accessible through aka.ms/awesome-azd. And this is a curated template gallery that includes all kinds of templates. We have the ability to sort through all kinds of languages and Azure offerings. You don't necessarily have to care about the Azure offerings because the idea is that you can find something that maps to your app stack and then leverage the infrastructure as code. So we make some decisions and choices about infrastructure for you. But I'm filtered to the Python language. We've got a number of different templates. There's some AI templates. There's some Jupyter notebooks. There's a Jupyter notebooks template that I authored. But today I'm going to be talking through that to-do application that I had mentioned earlier. That's hosted on Azure Container Apps. I'm going to zoom and enhance because I think that might be small. Okay. So again, everything is open source. Like the tool and all of our templates are open source. When you come to an Azure Developer CLI template, you'll notice that it's tagged with this AZD templates topic. You can also find AZD templates. Yeah, I did open that. On the AZD templates topic on GitHub. There are like 60 here. Some of them are in the gallery, some are not. But yeah, we have some pretty cool samples there too, like this bring your own data chat GPT template that was authored that went sort of viral, which is pretty neat. But yeah, so you'll see that tag. You'll also see like a blurb about the application stack so that you can like understand if it would map to your particular application you're working on locally. And then as you kind of scroll down, there's like information about kind of the requirements. So the Azure Developer CLI has only one prereq, which is that you have Git installed on your machine, which I think most people probably already have installed. And then each template will have its own set of dependencies. So in this case, we have Python, Node for our front end, and Docker because we are deploying to Azure Container Apps and we're going to build container images. There's also quick start set information as well as an architecture diagram so you can understand kind of what's happening on Azure. And then some information about our VS Code extension, which I'll show off as well. But yeah, so I'm gonna use this template. I'm gonna go ahead and I scrolled right past it and copy this azd init command. One thing I skipped over because I switched slides is that you're gonna wanna install azd and authenticate before you get started. I can pull that slide back up.
You want to give us a few minutes to actually do that? Or?
Yeah. Yeah, I can pause here too as well while people kind of get it installed. But this is so head over here and grab, we have instructions for any operating system. And then if you have problems getting installed, let us know. Yeah, wave frantically. And then after you get it installed, run azd auth login, which we can talk about in a second, but if you're already ahead, just want to mention that so that folks can get set up.
What was the one that went viral while people were waiting?
Yeah, so there's a team that works on Azure Cognitive Services, and they authored this template that allows you to pass in your own data set and train ChatGPT on it. So they have like this front, like it's actually a Python template too. But they have like a full like web app that like allows you to like ask it questions. And I think the example data they were using was like healthcare plan data for a company. So they passed in a full data set and someone could write like, oh, like is such and such a thing covered on my healthcare plan? And it would like spit out like an answer, which is super cool. Yeah, so that does exist as well.
I wasn't online during that one.
Yeah,
That's cool.
it's like definitely our most popular template. It has like, I think 1.3K stars on GitHub right now, which is like wild. But yeah, also if like, I'm gonna go through this to do Python, Mongo, Azure Container Apps example, but if you feel compelled to try some other sample from the template gallery, you are more than welcome to. Just note that you're gonna have to install whatever prereqs it requires, so.
How do you launch it again once it's installed?
So if you type azd in your terminal, or like azd-h for the help menu, that's probably a good way to validate that it's installed. And then for authentication, it's just azd auth login, and that should open a browser for you to authenticate on Azure. It'll bring you to the Azure page, and then you also might want to grab the free credits if you want to. Yeah. Yeah, everyone loves free things. Yeah. Probably wait, like, I don't know. What time is it right now? It's 12:53, so I have 40 minutes left.
You're going to be checking if you at a certain time?
We'll probably give folks like another like 5 minutes to get set up, and then I'm gonna get rolling because I want to make sure we have time to go through the whole workflow. And also, if there's, I'll also plug that if folks have questions about azd later on during PyCon, or they didn't make it through the flow during this, I'll be hanging out at the Microsoft booth pretty much all day tomorrow and on Friday, or Saturday, I guess. So feel free to stop by. I'll also be giving like a abbreviated version of this session again at the demo booth. Yeah, you can, I think it's
And redeeming credits are on that second link, right?
Yeah, so there's like the like instructions, they're separately from the actual, like, where you need to redeem them. I think it has you create like a temp account. Okay, show of hands, who's like ready to roll? Who's like, okay, so, no, it's timid hands, half hands. Okay, we're close. I just wanna make sure we're not waiting too long. No rush.
It may seem straightforward, but
Okay.
it's just the link and then you type it in.
Okay. Just so to create some clarity over redeeming credits, I believe that you go to the second link, not the azd-pycon, because that's for the repo, but if you go to the redeeming Azure code credit and then enter that code that's at the top, that should suffice. The instructions are on like a different page if you want instructions, but I believe if you just go to that link, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong if that was not, that's the flow? Great. Wonderful.
There's like one screen in routine where it confirms who you are logged in, and then it has a long bar where you can type it in, and then it processes the,
Okay.
and then I'll tell you if it works.
Okay. The one other thing that as people get going, we might run into is they might need to add a contributor role to the subscription. Yeah, you,
Setting the instructions.
It was a good question. So,
That's what it's going on.
yeah.
So then it's not lost in the room.
I do like comprehensives like that. Okay, but it's redirected.
Yeah, it's
Take a little bit of
eventually
time.
gets it, but we might handle it.
Yeah, it's gonna work. And it works. It was good. Cool.
Okay, so now I can just go out with
Yes. And, yep, I think so, yep. And then you should have the credits that way when you just go through.
these all and then try to find it is on the same storage.
I'm pretty sure they're all different.
So I'll do it with my daughter.
say that again? Okay, I think we're gonna get rolling, and if folks are playing catch-up, that's also totally cool. Yeah, okay. So, like I mentioned before, I am gonna use this to do Python Mongo sample after I've already authenticated. I'm going to use azd-init --template. For this particular template, because it's one that our team has authored, it's hard-coded in the CLI, so we don't have to pass in anything about the GitHub org or user. If you were using another template, you would want to just pass in the full GitHub URL as the parameter for that template, or the template argument. So in this case, I'm going to actually go and I'll create a new directory, and I'll call it, let's call it PyCon. I can't type. Typing live is scary. PyCon live. And then what I'll do is I'll run that azd-init command. And so, okay, it pulled down some template code for me. Now it's asking for an environment. And now because this is a Python audience, I feel obligated to tell you this is not your virtual environment name. So don't pass that in. This is an environment name that is going to like be part of the resource group that's going to act as a nice little bucket for all of our resources on Azure. And so you can name this whatever you want. It should be unique for your particular subscription. And in a real world environment, you might want something like dev, test, and prod environments with different sets of resources for each environment, which AZD can handle using the AZD-env command. We're not going to show that today, so I'm just going to call this like Savannah PyCon live, maybe? And then seemingly nothing happened. No, things did happen. I actually now have stuff lives in this directory now, and I'm going to show the template code and walk you through what's in the template in VS Code. So I'll open my VS Code instance using code dot. Nice little quick command to get into VS Code with my current directory. I'll also zoom and enhance because it's kind of small. This looks aggressively large, but I think it's more legible. Okay, so we have some stuff in here. Let's talk about what makes an AZD template an AZD template. So right off the bat, we have this thing called an Azure.yaml. This is sort of the entry point for the Azure Developer CLI to understand what this project is. So in this case, we have some name, metadata, template stuff. That's truly just metadata. You can name it whatever you'd like. Then we have a services property, and under there we have a web and an API. That's our front end and our back end. And under each one of those, we have a project directory, which passes in a path. That path corresponds with where my app code lives. So in this case, I have an SRC directory with our API, which is Python. Also contains a Docker file, which we'll talk about in a bit, and a web front end, which is a React TypeScript project. So we don't mandate any particular application folder structure. So if you had something completely different, you would just need to change that first line to map to where that app code lives. In this case, we have an SRC directory. I'm going to skip over module and come back to it in just a second. And then we have language. So again, JavaScript front end, Python back end. And then our host is Azure Container Apps. And we support various other hosts on Azure as well. Azure Functions, Azure Static Web Apps, App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, whatever you want. And so that's like the structure of an AZD, like the core thing that makes an AZD template an AZD template. The other requirement, and the reason that I skipped over module, is that that corresponds to where our infrastructure as code lives for that particular component of our application. So if I go into this infra directory, this is the other requirement of an AZD template, is that we have an infra directory with a main.bicep if we were writing bicep, or a main.tf if we're writing Terraform. And so this app web corresponds with this app web. But in this main.bicep, which is where all of our modules, all of those 9 components I talked about, all live at this very top level. So if we go through here, we've got a bunch of like strings that we're going to pass in that AZD is going to wire up for us. But the main things to really look at here are our resource group, which again is that bucket that we're going to contain all of our Azure bits on, or in rather. A container apps environment, as well as our container registry for our images, our web front end, and our API back end. These are both container apps that will live in our environment. API access for Key Vault, which allows us to access keys that are stored in our key store. Cosmos DB for MongoDB. So this could very easily be Postgres or SQL Server, Azure SQL, whatever you like. The actual Key Vault instance, and then some monitoring infrastructure to get us to set up our dashboard and all of that good stuff. We also have an optional feature here, which you can enable using an environment variable. This is detailed in the README for APIM, which allows us to have like mediated requests between our front end and back end. We are not going to be enabling that for this demo because it does take a little bit to provision. And then some output parameters that have a bunch of metadata about our application. And so that main.bicep and that Azure YAML are the key things. How you structure your IAC, how you structure your application source code, completely up to you. So that's kind of the infrastructure as code stuff. And the idea, right, is that you would take that SRC, that application source code, which is included as a proof of concept so that you can understand kind of the type of application that would work with this template, swap it out for your own source code, and then leverage all of the infrastructure as code assets so that you don't have to think about Azure stuff on day 0. talking about local development, we also have VS Code directory with our launch JSON, our task JSON for setting up our debug and local development configuration, so that's super nice, as well as a dev container definition. So if you were to open this in Codespaces, the image would actually have AZD installed with all of the right Azure extensions so that you're like off to the races right away. And then we have, the last thing I want to mention is sort of this ASDO and GitHub directory. These contain our CI/CD. I'm not used to the mouse pad. I usually use an external mouse. These contain our skeletons for our CI/CD pipeline definitions. And so in this case, GitHub Actions is our default provider. You can totally override it with Azure Pipelines by passing in a flag if you so choose to do so, or if you were to delete the GitHub directory, we would just default to Azure Pipelines. But in here, we are going to actually be running provision and deploy in our pipeline using the exact same commands that you would run in the terminal, which I think is really nice because it means that things are very consistent and easy to debug because you're using the exact same commands regardless of what kind of the client that you're using. So whether you're in VS Code, Visual Studio, Codespaces, in your terminal, in CI, same commands, non-magical. So yeah, that's pretty much the template structure. We're gonna get to doing fun stuff now. So because I'm in VS Code, I have a couple of different options for running AZD because I have the Azure Developer CLI extension installed. I can either right-click on our Azure YAML and I'll see all of the AZD commands there. Again, this is really like our entry point for the Azure Developer CLI. We could also very easily open the command palette with Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P and type Azure Developer and see all the commands. Or I could just invoke it in the terminal. I personally really like right-clicking on the Azure YAML from VS Code because I think it's really quick. So what I'm going to do is let me actually open a terminal real quick, and then let that initialize. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run AZD up. And I'll talk about this command in just a second. Oh, there is a bug here. I feel like I didn't pray to the demo gods today. This happened this morning too. Okay, so when you run AZD up, this is a magical command. This is a workflow command. So what this does is it actually combines 3 commands or like 2.5 commands into one command. So it combines packaging your application code. So in this case, we're going to be building Docker or container images based on those Docker files. Provisioning infrastructure, using our infrastructure as code that's in the infra directory, and then deploying our source code, those images, onto the container app host. I say 2.5 commands because if you were to run each of these commands individually, so let's say instead of doing AZD up, you want to do package, provision, deploy, you actually don't have to call package ahead of time. You can just do a provision and a deploy. We have package at the beginning of this command because there are actually cases where folks want to generate their infrastructure as code as opposed to like authoring them. So authoring it. So we want to make sure that the infrastructure as code exists before we try to do their provision. So I ran AZD up. It's going to be asking me for a subscription, so I'm going to go ahead and choose my subscription. And then it's going to ask me to choose a location. I'm just going to click East US 2, and then we're off to the races. And so, transparently, this is not a 1-minute operation, right? If we were throwing stuff on a VM, maybe it would be. But we are building container images. We are provisioning all of those 9 resources, stitching them together, setting up our database, setting up Key Vault, setting up all the roles, all the permissions, everything, and then deploying our images onto those container app environment, or in the container apps in that environment. And so this does take 5 minutes, maybe. We're on conference Wi-Fi, so who knows? But basically, as this we go through this, you'll see all of these resources that are being provisioned with unique identifiers that you can reference in the Azure portal. And so. Yeah, so we'll pause here. If folks are following along, you're welcome to run AZD up. This is going to take a couple minutes. If folks are ready to move forward, I have done some demo magic and done an AZD up ahead of time so that in case things didn't work out, we weren't totally hosed. So yeah, I'll pause for, 3 minutes-ish. Yeah, Don, what questions do you have?
Always chock full of questions.
I love questions. Yeah, so it's hard because this is like ultra zoomed in. But I guess one thing I could talk about here is like what would it take if I were to swap out my own, my app code for, or this app code for my own app code. Again, we don't mandate any particular structure for your folder, but the things that you would want to check out if you were using container apps are, one, that your Docker files, and I'll also open the Docker file. Let's just use the API Docker file for a second. Like, the actual port that's exposed here needs to match something like the port that's exposed in, where's API? The port that's exposed here on the actual container. So stuff like, I love using container apps because it's, I don't know, writing a Docker file is pretty approachable for me. Also now the output looks super weird because we went super narrow. But I feel like writing a Docker file is super approachable, and then what I really need to do is just like change the ports, make sure that my Azure YAML paths for my project match the Azure or the actual paths in my project, and then make sure that my infrastructure as code modules map up. So I feel like it's pretty approachable. But yeah, is anyone still trying to work through this, or we're good to move on? How are we feeling? Okay. This is actually, we're at the very last step. The kind of limiting factor here is provisioning a database and getting all that wired up because all the connection strings and everything are stored in Key Vault. So we'll do a 1-2 switch. We'll do a switch. Cool. So I sort of faked this. No, I actually ran it earlier. I just wanted to do this ahead of time. But at the end of all of this, right, we have 2 endpoints that are printed out for us, one for our front end, one for our back end. So if I go ahead and click this, I'm going to see, let me go, oh my gosh. I'm going to go back here and open these 2 up. Oops. And I'm going to see, in this case, this template included an openapi.yaml, so we're going to see a full OpenAPI schema that we can explore for our endpoints right there, which is super nice. And then we have a fully fledged web app up and running on Azure. So in this case, again, this is a to-do application. I can add tasks, tick them off. Shout out to my cats, Nori and Miso, who made an appearance at PyCon. But yeah, so yeah, that's pretty much like the crux of it, I guess. The kind of nice thing is that if you're not changing your infrastructure as code, you don't actually have to run provision again. You only really have to run provision if you're changing settings there or configurations. And so day to day, you might really just want to run AZD deploy. You know, you make a change to your app code, you build the images again, you deploy. Deploy will inherently build the images again if you don't call package ahead of time. So it's really like a one click or one command deploy, which is really nice. No kind of working through the Azure portal trying to find the right place. Cool. The next thing I want to show is pretty quick, but I mentioned that we had monitoring infrastructure set up. So if I run AZD monitor, I can choose the overview dashboard. I have some options there. But this is going to show us all the metrics, a bunch of metrics for our application for, I'm going to have to authenticate on my, yep, okay. All of the metrics for our application, so like usage, reliability, performance metrics, really just trying to provide you with like a solid foundation to build on. And again, like, I don't know about any of you, but I've spent like a long time building dashboards. So for me, this is like a very big time saver to have this all set up for me. So also it's nice, AZD Monitor just brings you to the right place in the portal. So you're not like clicking through like 7 pages to find the right dashboard page, which I think is sort of nice from a local development context. And then finally, this is probably my favorite command, honestly. It's setting up CI/CD, and so this seems like pretty basic because we just have that, the definition, that skeleton definition for our CI/CD pipeline included in the repo. But this is actually pretty powerful because it really wants my PyEnv shell to like initialize. This will, if I haven't already, will set up a new private repo for me, or I can push to an existing repo. You can authenticate we use the GitHub CLI under the hood in AZD local scope. So if you don't have that installed, this looks really crazy because I have the window very small and I'm zoomed in. But it will create a repo, let you authenticate using SSH or HTTPS. It will create repo secrets, set up a service principal so that Azure and GitHub can talk to one another. This PyEnv bug, I don't know what's happening. And so it'll really set up everything for you so that you don't have to go and like manage any of that configurations and like set up all the secrets so that GitHub and Azure can really talk to one another. And so on every commit now, you'll have, you will have, I didn't pull up the repo. Sorry about that. You can test your code on every commit to the repo, which is super, super nice. So if I go, this is the repo that I created, this PyCon demo final. And if I go to my Actions tab, I will see that there is a pipeline run kicked off. And I've run this a couple times because I did prepare for this talk. And I will see that we are initializing containers. GitHub Actions by default with AZD will authenticate using federated credentials, so OIDC, which is another security best practice, unless you opt out and decide you want client credentials, and then run AZD provision, AZD deploy. So that's basically AZD up being run in CI, which is super nice for consistency, easy to debug, non-magical. Again, I love that it's non-magical. So I have some screenshots. That sort of brings us to like the end of this session, really. This is like what we just kind of walked through. So when you start out, you really start out with like what am I building? What template do I need? So that's where you'd want to look at awesome AZD, or you could run the AZD template list command, which will list some hard-coded templates. But really, I think looking at awesome AZD is great because it's both open source community templates as well as ones that Microsoft teams have authored. Then you would want to run AZD provision to create that all of your infrastructure based off those infrastructure as code files written in either Bicep or Terraform. AZD deploy to get all your code running in the cloud, or just package that up really nicely with AZD up. And then AZD monitor and AZD pipeline config to kind of infuse those best practices into your workflow, make sure that you're kind of setting future you up for success, right? So yeah. And so I hope that this session has been insightful or at least kind of interesting, and maybe I've convinced you that the cloud is actually kind of cool, but only really when you have the right tools for your workflow. And yeah, I'll leave this slide up. This has a bunch of resources for this talk, but also learning more about the Azure Developer CLI, our GitHub repo for the core CLI tool, as well as our GitHub or our VS Code extension. We host monthly community stand-ups on YouTube and on Twitch. So if you're interested in learning about all the new stuff coming to the Azure Developer CLI, definitely check that out. All of the live streams are also recorded, so you can watch old ones if you want. And then this is a link to the template gallery, that awesome AZD website, which will bring you right to the Python templates. So thanks very much. And if folks have questions or they just want to talk, that's also cool. So, yeah.
Did you say a few words about monthly deployed license? How much does it cost? What is the... Oh, yeah. And then maybe expand if we did something wrong, we're going to shut it down.
Oh, yeah.
Start over and
Okay. Yeah, so the question was, how much does all of this cost? So it'll depend on each particular template you're running. So like each template has a different set of infrastructure, and all of the READMEs do have links to pricing calculators so that we can transparently know how much stuff is going to cost on Azure. And then the second question was, how do I tear all of this down? Which is a great question. We also have a command for that I did not show, because it does also take some time. But if I ran azd-h, I could scroll up. And there is a command called azd down, opposite of up, which will tear down all of your infrastructure and all of your deployments. So if I ran azd down, it would start kind of doing that for me, which is basically the same operation that you could do in the Azure portal. Just nice to have it somewhere that somewhere locally in the context where you're working, so you're not context switching. So yeah. Yeah. And I'll be around again like the rest of the conference at the Microsoft booth and giving a abbreviated version of this talk. Is it tomorrow? Is that for Friday, Saturday? I don't know, one of the days. But I'm there basically all day, so come say hi.
So that's deleting all the resource group and everything. Is there a way for you to deallocate stuff so it won't delete it, but it's still not being charged and stuff like that?
So if you have, so you're only charged for, so each service has kind of a different pricing structure, right? So like if there's some services which are kind of pay as you go. And so in this case, like if things aren't being like hit or like no one is like actually, you're not going to really be charged. There are definitely ones that have like monthly costs, so that's where like you'd want to check out the pricing calculator, make sure you know kind of.
So AZD does not, doesn't do this recognition, it would just delete everything.
Yeah, so there.
It's, I'm sorry.
No, there is one prompt that'll ask you if you want to purge your key vault, so that will like, it'll tear everything down, but if you can like soft delete that and like keep stuff around, or just like totally tear it down, both are options. This UI actually that I'm showing, it's unfortunate, like this tonight we're releasing a new version of AZD where this will have a much more verbose output where you'll actually see more steps about what's happening under the hood. We've been really working on kind of unifying our design language and making sure that everything feels consistent. So check out the latest release 0.9 or 0.8.1 that'll come out like tonight. I just didn't want to do the release right before a PyCon talk. You know, yeah. Yeah, maybe like don't do that. So yeah.
You will be speaking on Saturday at 12:30 p.m.
All right, come say hi, folks. But yeah, we also have some pins, some Azure pins at the front if you want to grab one. We also will have VS Code, GitHub, and Bit, who's a little raccoon, that's sort of our mascot, pins for that too at the booth, as well as many stickers. So come grab some swag. And like mouse pads, right?
Yeah.
VS Code hotkey mouse pads, y'all.